a seat. So, welcome to this panel. We're going to talk about supply chains, future of supply chains. Sorry, hear me now, right? I think I didn't follow instructions properly. I should have waited. Supply chains have had a very interesting development in the last few years, especially a lot of disruptions happening, especially with the pandemic, but also the wars that are happening. And that has led to, in part, was one of the main reasons, actually, for the surge in inflation. So supply chains are very much front and center. This comes at a time now also when you have regional blocks now redeveloping, if you want, and there's a lot of discussion about what that means for global trade and supply chains in particular. I have with me on the panel, I'd like to introduce first to my left, I have Henadi Saaleh, she's the Chairperson of Agility. Then I have Lorenzo Simonelli, Chairman and CEO of Baker Hughes, Alex Yang, co-founder and CEO of Tuya Smart, and Ryan Peterson, founder and CEO of Flexport. So I have really two people who are very much on the ground, impacted very directly by what's happening, by the changes and the pressures that supply chains are witnessing, as well as two CEOs, two leaders who are using technology to try and deal with some of these challenges. But I'd like to start with Henadi and ask you about, we've had a long period where globalization was kind of unstoppable, right? You had to have global trade, free trade, and there was big benefits that were derived from that. You had, I think you mentioned to me earlier that about 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty because of the wealth that was created by global trade. How have the changes, how have the disruptions impacted your business in recent years?
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be in this panel. So let's talk about disruption. So today, when you think about disruption, it's become a constant. And on the back of that, trade has reconfigured. Just look at the past 5 years. You had the geopolitical impact with the Israel-Gaza war and the Red Sea crisis. On the back of that, you also have the Russian-Ukraine war with the fuel impact. Not just that, you have the pandemics. The pandemics pretty much grounded a lot of airlines, climate change. The example is the Panama Canal. And then not just that, with the trade restrictions, they've grown fivefold in the past 7 years. So it definitely has impacted trade. It's definitely reconfigured trade. Today you have countries traveling longer distance than they would have. So you look at the trade between Brazil and Mexico taking a lot longer. You have connector countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Mexico, where trade is booming. That is definitely impacted. And I think what's quite relevant for all of us sitting here today is when we think about running our businesses and managing our businesses, disruption to the supply chain now happens every 3.5 years. And within that supply chain, within a 10-year span, every company will go through a 40% loss in profitability within 1 year. So if you think about it from a CEO perspective, with an average global span of around 8 years, you have to face a supply chain disruption at least 2 years in your career. So I think my colleagues over here on the panel have some important lessons to learn from.
From that. Lorenzo, let me ask you about Baker Hughes and how your company has handled the disruptions. How has it impacted you, and what are the changes that you've had to make in response to that?
Definitely, and it's wonderful to be here and also on this esteemed panel. And I think resilience is really what comes to mind. If you think about global supply chains, they've been very much disrupted as you've looked at globalization being a theme that is hampered by tariffs, by geopolitical constraints, as well as the necessity to localize. And so at Baker Hughes, what we've taken on board is an approach of regionalization, and also resilience. You can never be dependent just on one supply source, and you also have to look to be capable within a global and local capacity. And so as we look at our manufacturing footprint, we're in 120 countries in which we've actually got facilities in over 50 of those. When we look at our span of supply base, we've got over 2,500 suppliers that on an annual basis, we're procuring over $50 billion worth of materials and products and services. So it really comes down to a strategic view of making sure you manage the risk. And as we go forward, I don't think that changes at all. If anything, especially with the geopolitical climate we're under, it requires even more aspect of attention from a risk management perspective. And then I'm sure we'll get into the way in which technology can enable us to also manage risk in the future. But today, all about resilience.
I mean, resilience, though, can be expensive. Is that fair to say?
It definitely can be expensive.
Yeah.
And you have to balance the expense with the risk.
Yeah.
And as you look at localization, that's one of the ways in which to balance it as well. If you look at the kingdom, for example, a couple of years ago, Aramco initiated a program of in-kingdom total value add. And what that made as a benefit was if you came and localized, you would be given a premium. And that's beneficial for the kingdom because it provides them employment, it provides an educational base, allows them to grow their economy. At the same time, you manage to withstand the resilience by being able to get some preferential margin and a premium to the price. And that has to be the collaboration and the ecosystem that's created between countries and companies as we go forward.
I'd like to come back on that cooperation and the resilience. If you localize, is there a loser in, for example, some of the developing countries who may no longer benefit from being a cheap producer? But Alex, your company deals with manufacturers. You help manufacturers become more efficient. What's your experience with manufacturers? Are they coming to you with that localization that Lorenzo is talking about?
Yeah, I think that's the guest already shared the same opinion. That's right now the new form of globalization is started. It's inevitable. So we believe that only the localization can bring in globalization. And so how you be able to find a smarter way to localize different factors of the different pipeline on the industry. I think that'd be essential. So for us, it's one of the things that can improve efficiency is that how much you can standardize the technology. So one thing is that including the manufacturers, the engineering tools, the specifications, instruments, and the way they design it, they produce it, the way they manage the quantity, I think that will be the key part. And how you can standardize all the component.
Is that a role of government to standardize that, or are you saying within a company, for example, that they?
I think that's I can only rely on the commerce.
Right.
Because you rely on the regulators, it's essential, but sometimes it's not efficient enough because the technology moving so fast. So the things that whether agree on that, we should have type of the ecosystem, push the ecosystem to work together, try to standardize a lot of components, simplify that. And then you can scale as much as you can a single component and bring the effort to the global market.
Ryan, your company helps, Flexport helps, you were mentioning mostly SMEs, right? Is where most of your revenue comes from in terms of helping them ship from one place to another, not just from port to port. Do you see this localization also happening now, or do you think it's not going to last? That at the end of the day, people will still go to the cheaper option.
I think it's very interesting here, Lorenzo. Resilience does cost money, and not everybody can afford it, and it's not whether or not they can afford it. Sometimes they can't afford to make the decision because what it ultimately means is having more inventory or having you have your cheapest supplier, but now you got to work with also your second cheapest supplier, and it looks ugly in the P&L. And you've got to have a very strong leadership team who's got the board's the shareholders believe in them in order to continue doing that, because at the end of the day, if it looks bad on the P&L, you go, why do you have all this inventory sitting here just in case maybe something goes wrong? And once every 10 years you're a hero, and then for 9 years you look terrible. That's kind of hard to maintain. So it isn't easy for companies to maintain that posture in a period where things are looking like they're normalizing. And ultimately, we are seeing it's a well-known story across the world that manufacturing is shifting out of China, or people are diversifying. And my thesis, some of this is around tariffs, and maybe it's a little bit geopolitical, but at the end of the day, people make decisions around money. So yes, tariffs, but also labor costs. It's no longer the low-cost labor solution in the world. And so you're seeing quite a bit, but there is no second China. It's diversifying across Vietnam and half a dozen other countries that are going to benefit, that are growing like crazy. So, but at the end of the day, my view is not that the manufacturing is just going to move close to the destination and it's the end of globalization, because ultimately manufacturing is going to go wherever the labor is cheap and you can get the high quality products made cheaply.
Henadi?
Yeah, no, just building on what they're saying. I mean, the just-in-case options is what actually becomes quite critical. And when you think about it, you have to have, as you mentioned, resiliency and agility. So if you look at companies over the past 2 years, 70% of them have changed sort of their manufacturing supply chain options. And yes, it does come at a cost of price to convenience. So that is one option. But when you apply technology and that agility and resiliency together to drive greater visibility, greater tracking, and also embed it within the system to give you the ability to make better decisions, that's where you have the kicker. And there are studies that have been shown that if you're able to apply that, your revenue grows during disruptions by around 3% in various companies when they were tracking sort of the impact on COVID. But I think one key question for all of us is not just getting ready for that, is how do we ensure we have a workforce that is technologically adaptable to actually apply and support resiliency, and actually to use technology in order to be able to withstand disruptions and to withstand these changes. And these are the things which I think going forward are things that most companies will have to grapple with.
Well, you mentioned the workforce, and again, you mentioned labor as well. Alex, your job is slightly different. Your argument is that by standardizing and automating, you might not need all that.
Yeah, so I think that's right now for us is that we try to provide improve the efficiency in two directions. So one way is that we try to lower the bar for all the designers, which means that we offer them a standardized toolkit and the testing environment, etc., and even conference design, let them to lead them. So for that part is that we rely less talent power to have the company, have the customers to come in, because they don't have to, it's not a heavy lift for them to invest. And the second part is that we try to build more and more use cases and try to duplicate it. And for those use cases, we'll ensure that can be something we can duplicate to other locations. So when we design the things, it comes with a multiple language, come with standards that can use for multiple locations, and then we try to do the go-to-market in the first time. So which means that a lot of customers, they join in the ecosystem, try to learn what other people are doing in other countries and what they accomplished here. So I think that will be the two things we try to improve the efficiency. And the last part is that we provide the life cycle, data flow. Like you mentioned, that's how you manage manufacturing is another thing. So whether you will be able to produce too much in the inventory side, and how you manage your inventory, how you manage your sales through, how you manage your forecast, that'll be another path.
Lorenzo, so in terms of the using technology, I know Baker Hughes has done a lot of that. Baker Hughes also has a lot of labor, has a lot of people who work for Baker Hughes. So does that resonate with you? And the efficiencies that Henadi is talking about, how has that helped you in managing that increase in cost? Does it really manage it completely, or there is definitely a cost that will be passed on to the consumer at the end of the day?
If you break it down, and I think it's going to vary by industries and also by the formulation and advancement of that industry, labor content really is diminishing from a standpoint of the cost base. And as you look at the globe, there are a number of locations that are now starting to actually standardize on a labor cost. So for us, it's not so much the labor element as it maybe is in some of the other industries. It's the aspect of resilience relative to being able to assure that the customer is able to receive the end product. And to that degree, technology plays a big role. If we think about 3D printing, the ability to have a printed part at site is a huge step forward than what used to be a fabrication and casting, which used to take months. So you're able to reduce the lead time, you're able to improve the customer experience by having a 3D printed part, both metallic or plastic, at site.
Can those last as long, or do you have to then, is that a temporary fix until a more durable part comes in? What are you finding?
They can last as long.
They can? Wow.
They can.
Cool.
And that's part of also the progress that's been made with 3D printing.
Yeah.
But we already today, if you take what used to be a forging of an impeller.
So that's already happening, you're saying? That's not an idea for the future, that's already...
That's already happening. We brought our first 3D printer into the kingdom, and I think it was the first 3D printer in the kingdom several years ago, and already started producing parts in Dhahran with this 3D printer. Likewise, as you go forward, more and more you can take bigger pieces of metal and actually 3D print them. 3D printing is one example, but then relative to digital data and utilizing that data to actually improve manufacturing excellence and reduce unplanned downtime. There is no need why you can't anticipate maintenance.
Yep.
And as we look at our factories, having that digital element envelope of that factory is driving efficiency. So as we go from globalization to regionalization, as you continue to have to compete, that labor content is becoming less of a factor. It's more the total cost of the end product and how you drive productivity through implementing technology, and then also differentiating with the capabilities in the country itself.
Yeah, correct. I think one of the nature of the technology right now is that we try to move the products be less and less labor related. We try to rely less on that part.
I agree with that. I mean, I look at a company that we've invested in, it's called Hylion. It's actually metal 3D prints a fuel agnostic generator. You know, so imagine at site, you know, 3D printing a fuel agnostic generator and what that does in terms of savings and capabilities. I definitely agree with what you're saying.
So we don't need globalization anymore, we don't need...
I mean,
No, I think...
by hand, it's not.
I think...
Sorry,
Yeah.
Alex, you were saying?
Yeah.
I said the iPhone is still made by hand.
Right.
That
Okay.
People, you know,
By hand.
well, part of
Like a hand, maybe.
it's a very high bar to clear.
Right.
You know, for a just-in-time case like 3D printing of parts, that makes tons of sense. If the line is down for an afternoon, it costs you millions or tens of millions. But the reason that they make the iPhone by hand, one is that imagine I came to you on stage today and I said, I'm going to pitch you my new robot startup. And we rent these robots. You don't have to buy them. We just rent them to you. And I have replicated a human brain perfectly. And it has the dexterity. Look at the way it can move its fingers. And I will rent them to you for $5 an hour. You would go, oh, I'm going to build a factory of these with 1,000 robots. Well, it turns out you can do that.
Yeah.
They're just called people, and you have billions of them around the world who want a job. So it's a very high bar to clear. I think we'll get there, but the dexterity of a human, the agility, great company name, by the way, the ability to change, you know, the iPhone, for example, they can make machines that would make a cheaper iPhone, probably. But the iPhone design changes every week. And if you have to retool a whole assembly line of machines, that's very costly. The iPhone, it's not one iPhone per year. They're tweaking it. They're making it a little bit better. They're finding little design. I don't know about every week, but they're changing it constantly. Humans can be retrained in a few hours to do that. So it's a very high bar to clear for people who are making kind of humanoid robotics or trying to replace people, because people are awesome. They're pretty good at a lot of stuff. So there'll be use cases for sure, but I think they're going to take a long time.
And 3D printing, it will work in manufacturing, but in terms of consumer goods that are shipped all over, I was wondering, that on its own, that's not going to be a problem solver, right? I mean, that's how big a part of your transportation is 3D printing able to resolve, for example?
3D printing is just one area that,
Right.
again, you're going to have as an associated capability, and it needs to be an ecosystem that you put together. People are still necessary. The impact of the cost of people, though, is less relevant on the end cost. And so how do you drive that total equation? You asked an interesting question before. So is globalization finished? Globalization is not finished. At the same time, it's a regionalization, and regions are going to decide whether they want to partake in globalization amongst themselves. And as a company that's global, we have to be able to navigate that. And that's where the risk management, the resilience comes in. Because from one day to the next, you could have a situation where a tariff or a sanction is put into place. And we have to deal with that as company leaders. And so I think regionalization will still be globalization. At the same time, you'll still have nationalism as well. And you have to be able to pivot and actually balance across all of those. And the best way to do that for a company is by having multiple ecosystems that are both self-independent as well as can work together with the technologies that we have. And that's going to be key in what is an uncertain world.
And
Sorry, Alex, you wanted to say something?
And to be able to achieve that, I think one of the key parts is that for the company, you need to really have a global ecosystem, because eventually when you want to have different footprint on the relocalized supply chain, you need the talent. So you need to have the ecosystem to be able to incubate the skillful talent for you in the long run. And then you'll be able to moving around. So that'll be one part.
Henadi?
yeah, no, and this is where actually the investment opportunity lies, if you think about it. I mean, you look at China investing over $1 trillion in infrastructure when it comes to One Belt, One Road. You look at Saudi Arabia investing over $260 billion to become a tier one logistics hub. And today, His Excellency Yasser talked about it. You know, it is a super connector. The reality, it is here today. You look companies like us doubling down and investing in logistics infrastructure in Riyadh. I mean, we've been investing over the past 20 years, and we will continue to invest. You look at countries like Egypt and their modernization and so on. I mean, these are where the opportunities lie to become in these logistics hubs to support and enable not just companies, but also SMEs and larger corporations.
Do you have some examples of SMEs you work with? You mentioned them before when we talked yesterday, I think.
Yeah, so we have a platform that also supports SME and cross-border trade, largely US, China, and Europe. And when it comes to that, I mean, trade is relatively complex when you think about it, in the sense of today, if I'm a small to medium-sized enterprise, Ryan, I'm sure you can talk to this, is you pick up the phone, you try and call a forwarder, they don't really care. I mean, you're here to ship, 1 or 2 shipments a month. It's not that interesting, but what we're able to do is they're able to go online, get a quote, see the visibility, what does this mean, what is the time, how long is it going to take from origin to destination, what are the choices, and they're able to actually transact. So there are lots of tools out there on the back of technology and digitization which supports and enable SMEs to cross-border trade, and at the same time supports them in managing to a large extent this disruption.
I wanted to ask, I mean, for the panel, you work globally. Is there a danger with the requirement for the resilience that Lorenzo is talking about, which costs money, for the investment in technology, which costs money, that we leave part of the world behind, that it is, China, Saudi Arabia, Europe, US that are making those investments, but then there's the global south, let's say, for want of a better term, that may not be able to keep up with those changes? Henadi, maybe?
So I think in anything that we do, whether it's investments in technology or thinking about agility or resiliency, we have to look at it as an entire ecosystem, an entire community. I mean, if we look at simply COVID, which was the pandemic of past, several years ago, we are all dependent and reliant on each other. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, as we invest in our own systems, we also consider those who cannot and find opportunities and investments in which it can be, given and sort of traded to the masses.
But I mean, Lorenzo, with the regionalization, that also might sort of leave out some countries who are now maybe benefiting by being able to provide the cheap input that now will be more expensive but more regional.
I'm an optimist, and I think when you look at the attributes of different locations, different countries, you've got to look at it holistically with regards to the commodities, the minerals, the labor, the talent pool. And when you have a global strategy around supply chain, there's opportunities for these attributes to make sense. There's going to be some locations where energy's cheaper. There's going to be some places where talent is better. There's going to be some locations where the commodities and minerals are more available and accessible. And that's how you create your regional approach to supply chain. I don't think there's a need to leave people behind because we need everybody to progress and continue to move upwards.
Okay. I have one more question to the panel. One of the disruptions has been climate change, for example, as well. How has that impacted your businesses? In terms of how you've had to adapt, in terms of the demand that you're seeing from customers. Maybe, Ryan, have you seen any changes from your clients on that?
There's a lot of demand for solutions.
Yeah.
There's unfortunately a shortage of supply of solutions.
Yeah.
And often these solutions are expensive, and as soon as they find out the price, there's less demand for the solution. But certainly it's on the tops of everyone's mind, especially in Europe. They want to be able to measure not just carbon, but other forms of gas. There's a lot of regulations coming down the pipe. We saw, for example, the big change in 2020 to low sulfur fuel in ocean freight. These things cost more, and if they push through a change on the use of bunker fuel, which is the main freight fuel used in ocean freight, to biodiesel and these things, they cost 5 or 6 times more.
Yeah.
And the world's not ready for freight to be 5 or 6 times more expensive. They
follow price. So, okay, well, I'd like to thank my panel. Thank you very much. We're out of time. So thank you to the FII for organizing this, and the room seems to have filled up. Thank you.